Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no bed. I was brought up and told to have no bed. I was brought up and told to have no bed.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG, Dr. Neal Holmes. Dr. Holmes, it's just us today. And I recall one time back at the University of Akron, Colonel Gaddafi was in the news for some reason. And of course, you know, the American media, the American government, you know, they weren't fans of Gaddafi coming from Libya. And I remember, I think I said something about him, and you said, whenever we talk about something, you have to examine what it means to our people, what it means to the Black community, because what the media is saying, what the government is saying, and the impact on the Black community don't always align, you know? So that's something that I remember, you know, you teaching me, and that, you know, that carried, you know, that stayed with me. So when we look at this situation in Afghanistan, and we've been here, 20, 25 years, I wanted to talk about, you know, how the withdrawal of the troops, how that's going to affect our community, if at all, and also how being there the last 20 something years is going to affect our community. One thing I think about is that, you know, when I was in high school and, you know, I was going off to college, most of my friends were going off to college, and I'm not going to lie, I'm not proud of this, but we looked at the guys that were going into the military as, oh, those are just guys that can't get into college, right? And so 20 some years later, I moved to DC and I meet guys that, you know, they retired from the military and they working for these defense contractors, making $300,000 a year, much more than I make, you know, $300,000, $400,000 a year. Some of them went to college while they were in the military, but some of them didn't. They just retired, got with these defense contractors. You know, they get these 0% down VA loans to buy homes, and they're doing great. But that may be due to the fact that we've been in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. Are those type of jobs about to dry up, you think?
You mean those military jobs?
Right, because
no, they're leaving Afghanistan because they want to move into Africa. And in a bigger way. They're not going anywhere. The question is, are those jobs, just because somebody's making $300,000, doesn't mean that's necessarily good for us as a people, because we have to see what's good for us in an international thing. And this thing about us or the U.S. being in Afghanistan for 20 years is not really correct. United States really started getting into Afghanistan in the 1970s under Jimmy Carter, and every administration since then, Democrat or Republican, has somehow been in Afghanistan. So I think the question that people are raising now is in terms of how the nature of how the U.S. is leaving, and in this kind of leaving in this kind of almost undisciplined kind of way, or in all that havoc, is the wrong question. The question is how or why should you get in these places in the first place? And when you get in, how come you're guaranteed to leave in a certain way? If you go in a certain place in a certain way, you're guaranteed to leave in a place from that place in a certain way. And that's the lesson from Vietnam, and there'll be lessons from some other places as well. So the question is, when the U.S. went into Afghanistan in the first time, and let's look, as the U.S. is leaving Afghanistan, we get a sense that somehow Afghani women are going to suffer from the Taliban. But when the U.S. went in the first time in the 70s, and it didn't go in, it went in covertly, not in big numbers, Afghan women suffered. And so let's give the background. That was a
While you're giving the background, could you tell me and people listening, and people ask me this all the time, Why did we go there in the first place?
Well, that's getting ready to talk about
That's
why
what
they
you
went
said.
in the
Okay.
first place. Back in the 60s, actually, in 70s, Afghanistan is an interesting place. Was an interesting place. So in the 60s and 70s, if you went to Kabul, which was the capital urban area, you'd see Afghani women with miniskirts on, and all the Europeans were coming in there looking for their hash or hashish or whatever you want to call it, and the hippies were coming in, and that was, and but the larger part of society is not urban, and so what we get a sense of is what's happened to some group of people who are urban, but the larger Afghan society is rural, and when people begin to see these Europeans coming in there having sex in the public, in the fountains and whatnot, there was a backlash to that, and but because the rural areas were were and are quite conservative. But the other thing that happened, the big thing that happened, was that there was a socialist takeover of government. The socialists overthrew the king, and the United States said it was founded on not having kings. You know, they overthrew, they broke away from King George III. Well, in
Right.
some ways, he's a pretty good guy, really, at least in terms of trying to protect some native indigenous people's interests, native people here, so-called Indians. But and the United States said that when it got started, when it was founded on the principle of not having kings, but having elected officials, presidents, or whatever. So this group of people would seem to be in the same mood of direction as the U.S. and since it was overthrowing the king, but what they did install was a socialist government. And when they installed that socialist government, that meant that right away women had rights, and women had a right to go to school, education, and so forth and so on. And in order to overthrow that socialist government, what the United States did was brought in some of its CIA, brought in some of its special ops people, what they call special ops, particularly Green Beret, which are training forces, and brought them in to work with groups that are going to overturn this group. And to overturn that group, they brought in the some of these warlords, and they have a traditional warlordism in that part of the world, in that country. And these warlords are really quite difficult fellows. They don't care for women. They were rapists. They were raping women. They were raping little boys, girls, and they were stealing whatever they could get their hands on. And so this was in order to keep the socialist structures in place. The Soviets later came in to back up that government, and that's when the U.S. kind of, what they say, doubled down on their involvement there. And once they did, the question rose, well, and this is basically what they said. I'm paraphrasing now what U.S. officials said. They said, well, basically, we're going to have to forget about women's rights and those things right now. We're going to have to overthrow this government. Mm-hmm. You see, so the not caring about women first came on the part of the United States back in the 70s, not in the 2000s. We think about going into 2001 after but the 2001 actually happened in many ways as a result of what happened in the 70s. Amongst the people that the U.S. was training was Osama bin Laden. The CIA helped to train his forces to help to fight against the socialist government in Afghanistan and their Soviet backers. Now, the other thing that we have to understand is that Afghans are interesting people in the sense that they are proud of their heritage. They live in from what I understand, a very beautiful mountainous kind of place. They say the sky is beautiful, these huge mountains. And they are not necessarily people who are, at least the majority of the people, the rural people, are not necessarily people who care necessarily for being in in Europe or United States. They like their way of life. They feel great about their way of life. I mean, they understand that some things they would like to have better. Life can be harsh, but they aren't necessarily people who are lusting after the American way of life, so to speak. And in many ways, they don't see women here as especially being having great rights when they see the way that we sexually objectify women with,
Right.
and so forth. To sell a car, you put a scantily clad model on a car, drape her across the car, and etc. So they don't see the way that women are treated in the West as necessarily any better than the way that women are treated there.
Right.
But the thing that we have to remember is that the United States came in to defeat a socialist movement. In order to defeat the socialist movement, they tore up the country. After they tore up the country, that's when we see the emergence of the Taliban. Taliban comes from the word talib, which means student. And these Taliban were students who were forced out of the country because of these warlords, basically, and these things. And they went and they studied in Pakistan in these madrasas or schools, Islamic-based schools, where they not only studied Quran, but they also studied Kalishnikov. You know, they studied AK-47. And because they were being students, not just to learn things, but they were trying to redeem their country from these warlords. The country was in upheaval, and the U.S. was one of the main reasons that the country was in upheaval. And you have to remember something. The United States has a saying that they adopted from the British. There's an Anglo-American political idea. It says that we have no friends, we have no permanent friends. We're no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. So what that means is that aside from maybe the British and possibly Israel, the United States has no long-term friends. So it can be your friend today militarily and be your enemy tomorrow. And we see it time after time after time again. For instance, in order to defeat the Nazis, and you have to understand that the Nazis were, the US, a lot of big money went into the Nazis to help build them, because the idea was that the Nazis were going to defeat the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of investment from this country went into the Soviet Union, into the building the Nazis to defeat the socialist movements that were going on in Germany. But Hitler had ideas that went beyond merely being falling behind the US and the Brits. And so he wanted to run things on his own. And at that point, he no longer became a friend, he became an enemy, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Our friend. And then at that particular point, the Soviets became no longer an enemy necessarily, but a friend. So if you think about the allies in World War II, there were United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. After Germany was defeated, and you have to remember the Red Army, the Soviet Army, was the first one into Germany. They were the ones that really defeated Hitler, fascism.
Mm-hmm.
But right after that war, the friend who was a friend in World War II now became an enemy, right?
Right.
And what now became the Cold War. And so we see this playing time and time again. So we go to Afghanistan. The U.S. goes in 1970, not in the year 2000, but 1970. They break up the place. And as a result, it's under the rule of these rapacious warlords who are just really wreaking havoc, and they're bombing, they're fighting each other, because each of them has a little army. The Taliban, these students, these youngsters, And you have to remember the burqa that they talk about and they ridicule women covered from head to foot uh, was a way of actually being protected in a place like Pakistan. Because Pakistan, in many urban areas, you have a lot of stuff. You had drug addiction, because you're talking about where a lot of this poppy, where the heroin comes from around the world, its main ingredient and so forth. So here comes so the Taliban comes in and shuts the warlords down, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a rough justice, but they shut them down. And they shut them down, and they took over the bulk of the country. There was an area to the north where you had the Northern Alliance that had still had some were still a little separate from those folks. So, and they brought in, and remember, these are rural guys. These are not city people. They're bringing in a rural type of governance into the place. So they shut it down, and the United States has trained what became in alliance with the Saudis. They had trained bin Laden. The CIA helped to train bin Laden as part of this move. So he became a friend.
Now, let me ask you, it's funny because when you first talk about why we went there to fight the Soviet, and it reminds me of the Vietnam thing, going to fight the spread of communism. Seems like we would have learned our lesson from that, or our government would have learned the lesson from that. So if you're going into Afghanistan as well for almost the same purpose, then why, when the Soviet Union dissolved in '91, why didn't our government pull the troops out then?
Well, see, that's the big question, because and there's a book that just came out which looks at this question. This guy named Samuel Moyn, and he's looking at, hey, you had this period after 1989 and really 1991, when the Soviet dissolves itself, collapses, that you have this possibility for peace, but you have to understand that that the battle for the Soviet Union against the Soviet Union had nothing to do with bringing about peace necessarily. The battle. There's a guy named A.J. Hopkins has a really good book out, came out a couple years ago, and basically what he's pointing out is that this thing that we call the Cold War, which many people look at as a war between capitalism and communism and so forth, and between Soviet Union and United States. He said really what the real thing was all about was, it was really a battle to determine about Africa and Asia and these countries that were about to get independence. That's what it was a question about. What was that going to be about? What was the nature of that independence? So you have to remember that it's not just the United States hasn't learned a lesson, but African people, as Black people in this country, we haven't learned a lesson. For instance, Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader in Vietnam, used to live in Harlem. Used to work with the Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey movement. Ho Chi Minh used to write articles about lynching in the United States. And he supported us when he was our friend when he was in the United States. And he still even supported us when he was in North Vietnam. You understand? So we haven't learned our lessons. So we had leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who studied at an HBCU, studied at Lincoln University, used to preach in churches in Philadelphia, used to work in Chester in the shipyard, used to vend on the streets in Harlem in the middle of the Depression. He came over here in the middle of the Depression, was joined an African-American fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma, was very involved in the Black community here. And when he first came to power in Ghana, the first leader of an independent country in this particular period in what's called sub-Saharan Africa, and Africa below the Sahara. The first thing he did was bring over black folks from this country, help build the country.
Mhm.
And the next thing he did, and he began to say, hey, he echoed Garvey. He said, Ghana's independence by itself is meaningless. We have to, all of Africa has to be free. And in order for us to deal in this world, we have to be united. And Nkrumah built 1,500 industries in that country. A rubber factory, used to live in Akron, Ohio. He built a rubber factory, a tire factory, because much of the latex that comes to, that used to come to Akron, now goes all over the country now to make tires, comes from West Africa. So he said, we can make our own tires. Well, they pay those people, rubber tappers, $30 a month. You can't buy a tire for $30.
Right.
So he's saying, why can't we make our own tire? Build a rubber factory, right? A tire factory. Build a dam, and that dam, they have bauxite. He was going to build, he had a thing that processed that bauxite into alumina, which was on the way to make it into aluminum. So he understood that what Africa does and what these other countries do that are victims of what we call imperialism, they provide the world with raw materials and in turn have to buy those raw materials back as finished goods.
Right.
He was creating a modern industry where they would have their own finished goods. 1,500 industry. Included in this thing was a nuclear reactor for nuclear energy. You understand? This guy was rolling.
Right.
And he was also, when he was president, he was training and arming movement people down in Zimbabwe, what we now call Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, all those places. So the United States overthrew him in a coup. The CIA overthrew him. The country he supported, just getting its independence, Lumumba, the CIA, along with the Belgians, not only overthrew Lumumba's elected government, legally elected government, but they were involved in this assassination. They supported assassination. Assassination that was so vile that after he was assassinated, they put his body in a vat of acid. So people wouldn't be able to bury him and remember him, but people remember him.
Right.
This year, one of the white soldiers, Belgian soldiers, kept his tooth. That tooth is coming back to the Congo, and there's going to be a memorial built around that tooth. But the Congo had the purest uranium in the world that you need for atomic bombs. The atomic bombs the United States dropped on Japan, World War II, that came from Africa, from Congo. So here, the United States is involved in, was and is involved in anti-African, what we call imperialism, in order to maintain control over those resources and that wealth, because that's the wealth that keeps it in power. So the defeat of the Soviet Union didn't mean peace. What it meant was that now the United States could even with less, there's less, things to, there's less impediments to its movement around the world and its ability to dominate the world. And so it's going to do more, not less, right?
Right.
And so we're going to see more instability, not less. So we begin to see in places like Cuba, right now, Cuba, if you talk about what's in Black folks' interest in this country, Cuba every year takes in numbers of students to go into its medical school and gives them free medical training, some of the best medical training you can get. So and the only thing they ask of those Black students from this country is that when they go back, that they serve poor people. Right. That they're not coming here to become just rich doctors, but they're going in to alleviate health and suffering in their communities.
Let me understand this. So Cubans training Black doctors, and they want them to
for free.
For free, and then they want them to go back to their communities and serve.
Right.
They don't care about them doing it in Cuba. They just want to make sure.
No, Cuba has doctors.
Okay.
Some of the best doctors in the world. So and Cuba also has some things that we need, that the world needs, and some other things that they need, they can't get because there's an illegal blockade that the United States puts around Cuba. And you have to understand, a blockade is an act of war. So the United States has been has imposed warlike conditions on Cuba ever since 1960s, for over 60, 70 years or more. Now, okay, my subtraction ain't that great, but so right now the Cubans have 4 vaccines that they've developed for this COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the syringes necessarily. They don't have the level of syringes they need just to make the injections happen. But this is something the world needs.
Right.
Can't get. You see, so what we look at, we have to look at this thing from the inside out, that the United States is often the bad guy in the world. And it goes around pointing its fingers at other people. And it goes into this rut. Now, what was it trying to do? What was it in Afghanistan? We have a couple things in Afghanistan. You have some rare earths, and these are metals that are very important in terms of modern industry and war. But very importantly, it was strategic because they wanted to build a pipeline from Central Asia, and oil pipeline for Central Asia, and run it across Afghanistan to get that oil up. Once George Bush said, you can, we're going to, we can either, if you allow us to have this pipeline, we can shower you with gold, or if you don't allow, we can shower you with bombs. This had nothing to do with bin Laden.
Right.
Now, this was before 9/11. Now, after 9/11 happened, and the U.S. went in and they bombed the hell out of the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they used that, and they used that Northern Alliance to actually do the initial fighting on the ground. The Taliban were on the run, and the Taliban were reaching out they were about to surrender to the United States. And the U.S. said no. The Taliban would have surrendered or worked out, maybe some type of peace deal. I remember the Taliban, it was on national TV, and the Taliban leadership was saying, if you just provide us evidence of what bin Laden did, we can turn him over. But we can't just turn over somebody just because you say he did something. Where's the evidence?
Right.
And the U.S. never provided evidence. So you turned in something that should have been a policing situation into a military situation. And the person that really did that was Colin Powell. Now you have to remember that Colin Powell was already a war criminal because his involvement with the Milan Massacre. So we hold up some of the wrong people sometimes, simply because.
For the sake of our listeners, why don't you tell us about the Milan Massacre?
The Milan Massacre was a situation where in Vietnam, where American soldiers went into a village and they just wreaked havoc on that village, just killed all kinds of innocent people. And then there was a cover up because some of the soldiers got a little upset about it, and they wanted to say, hey, we shouldn't do this.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a cover up, and he was involved in that cover up. And so these are some of the things that we are talking about here, that you have these sorts of things. But it's Colin Powell who say, hey, this is a war situation, where it didn't have to be a war situation.
Right.
But to show you that it really wasn't a war, even after they had the thing kind of won, really the real deal was a broader deal. And Afghanistan was considered to be part of what it was called the greater Middle East in strategic jargon. And this war in the greater Middle East. And you had a group of people that we refer to as the Neocons. And the Neocons were formerly liberals in this country who had now become conservatives. And their key interest during this period was the support of Israel. And in order to support Israel, they wanted to get rid of all of the forces that were the most how you say, the ones which provided, seemed to be the greatest threat to Israel. And these people were not Islamicists in this particular sense. They might have been Muslims, but they were not Islamicists. They were mostly socialist nationalists, Arab socialists. So they had some belief, some form of Arab national socialism or Arab socialism. And they were nationalists. They were mostly secular. Saddam Hussein was one. Saddam Hussein actually protected Christians because Saddam used to like to drink, and Christians used to sell alcohol in Iraq. And Iraq was an interesting place. It was a place where women, the Arab women, the Iraqi women felt free. If they wanted to go to the club at night, they felt free. They could go. It wasn't a strict society. You had many mixed marriages, in the sense you had marriages between Shiite and Sunni people. Right. And I'm not saying Saddam was he was a tough guy though. You know, he was a pretty tough guy. So you had to wipe him out. You had to wipe, and one of the reasons you had to wipe him out beyond this other stuff was that Saddam was beginning to say, I'm going to sell my oil in something other than dollars. So what the United States was buying all this oil, it wanted to control the oil markets. What we call the Persian Gulf was named by the British, by Churchill. He called it an Anglo-Saxon lake. This was to be controlled by the British and the Americans, all the oil coming out of there. So the Americans, one of the ways they wanted to control the oil was, one, to have a military bases all in that area, but two, to make sure that all the oil was sold in dollars. So you had what we call petrodollars. And all the oil companies, all the oil countries, exporting countries in that region, use dollars for their in their business. But Saddam was one of the first to break with or think about breaking with this. And he said, well, you know, we might use euros, we might use something else. And so he had to be taken down. He was taken down, and he was replaced. And to take him down, you use Islamic people who were very Islamic, right, to help take him down. You also have in Libya, you had Colonel Gaddafi. You have to remember a couple things. Before Gaddafi came to power, the United States had one of his largest, his very largest Air Force base outside the United States was in North Africa, in Libya. And Gaddafi removed him from that place. Gaddafi also had a large number of West African students there learning and studying and all sorts of things. And he was one of the people who helped to form this thing called the African Union. And the idea of the African Union was sort of a continuation of Nkrumah's ideas of a united Africa. And so he was beginning to talk about a single currency. He had a bunch of gold that he was about to put in a bank, an African bank, right? So you have an IMF, you have an International Monetary Fund, and what they call a World Bank, which is dominated by the Europeans. You have an Asian bank, which is pretty much dominated by the Chinese, and he wanted to have an Africa bank, which would be dominated by the Africans themselves.
So he had to be taken out.
And they took him out. They remember they took him out on our boys' watch. Your boy, Barack Obama, and it was said that the reason that the U.S. is going in was to protect the citizens from Gaddafi. Well, they've been in. And but the citizens of Libya have not known one day of peace since, I think that was 2011 or so, when they went in after Gaddafi, or whenever they went in after Gaddafi. I think 2011. So it's been 10 years there. And there have been wars, rapes, and actually Black folks who used to come to Libya to study and go to school and learn and so forth were being lynched in public by these racist Arabs and some of the people that the United States was backing. They also, in order to take out Gaddafi, they let out of prison some of these jihadis. And now these jihadis that they let out are all over the Sahel region of Africa and Mali and Niger and different places, wreaking havoc there as well. So, so you see that the United States does these things. One of the groups that Joe Biden mentioned was the group down in Somalia, the Al-Shabaab. I'll tell you about Al-Shabaab. When there was the United States, Somalia does not have tribal differences. They're all one group, but they have different clans, and these clans have had difficulties with each other over time. Mm-hmm. And so at one point there was a government there that was backed by the Soviet Union. And so because it was backed by the Soviet Union, the United States put in a lot of guns, a lot of weapons, and weapons it was so cheap that one time you could buy an AK-47 for $18 in Somalia. Hmm. And weapons were cheaper than food. So, and so in order to deal with this thing, you had traditional group called Islamic Courts, because the people that are by and large Muslims, and they had these Islamic courts, and they began to deal quite successfully, really, with dealing with some of the tensions between these different clans. Al-Shabaab was at that time just a group of young people that assisted the courts. Again, another Bush, George Bush, the elder George Bush, said, "Hey, we got to get rid of these courts." The guy who was the ambassador to Somalia resigned because he said, "Why are you getting rid of these courts? They're doing an excellent job." He said, "You're going to create havoc. You're going to create all this warfare." Well, that's what the plan was, to create warfare. They wanted to make the place ungovernable.
Now, do you think? Oh, go ahead, Doc. Finish your point.
Yeah, they just wanted to make the place ungovernable because it was in a strategic place. So part of what's going on is to make life hell in the African world, not just in Africa, but in the African world. If you look at our communities, in many of our communities, life is hell because of policies that have been carried out by the government. Because in these communities, again, going back to the period of Black Power, when people began to assert themselves and say, "Well, we need to control our own communities," and they said, "We're going to make life hell in there." So you want to get the hell on out of there.
Do you think that's why, and that's why I was going with this, do you think that's why the U.S. government is finally pulling out of Afghanistan? They've wreaked enough.
Well, they're not pulling out. They're still there. They're still there. I mean, there's special ops are there. They're going to have CIA forces there. They're all around, and but they're pulling out because they were defeated, really. And basically, Donald Trump was the one who basically signed the thing last year. People talk about Joe Biden now, but last year Donald Trump went into a peace arrangement with the Taliban. It was just between the Taliban and the United States. It didn't include the government of Afghanistan, the government that was there. Right. And so basically said, "We're not going to fight you if you don't fight us. We'll do a little stuff here and there, but otherwise we're going to get out by May." So the original idea was to get out of there by May. Biden came in and extended it to September. He believed that the government was going to hold at least, they say, 6 months. To me, I didn't think it was going to hold because you had a couple of problems. One thing you have to understand is that the Taliban used to be the government. The Taliban was still the government over much of the country. So if you went to many of the rural areas, if you went to a village where the Taliban was government, you could at least be assured of a couple of things. One, that if you had some dispute with your neighbor, that there was going to be a court, and you could depend on the court resolving the thing. And like every court, you're not always going to be satisfied with the result. You know, nobody's, because there's always at least one party that's not going to be satisfied, but you're going to be reliable. But there were courts that operated. There were military that operated, the Taliban. They got paid. They didn't get paid much. They got paid, and by and large, the Taliban, some of the leadership was getting enriched, but by and large, it wasn't enriching. It wasn't getting hyper rich, you know. Now, if you look at the other side, the government, I mean, the best example is this guy Ghani, who was the president, and he flees the country in cars full of money, 150 millions of dollars. So it's probably an undercount. And he makes a big speech, the next day he's gone. Well, what's the problem? You go into areas where the government has troops and soldiers and police. First of all, the soldiers aren't getting paid because somebody's eating their money, right? It's the soldiers aren't getting paid. They're starving in some of these places. So you see, when the Taliban come in and they say, hey, here's some money, and just go to your family and go home, hell, they're going to tell you, I'm hungry. I've been sitting here out here. I haven't been getting paid.
Right.
Other thing is that in those areas, you had very little courts of justice. So if somebody had a problem, you know, nothing happened, or if something happened, it was only corruption that happened. Whoever justice went to, who paid the most money. That's what's happening in the bulk of the country, not just in Kabul among the urban folks. We're talking the bulk of the country, which is not urban, right?
Right.
You have about 5 or 6 urban centers. The rest of the country is rural. And so you know, these are sort of things that were going on. So you know, the government didn't have a great deal of respect. Ghani, you know, you had 2 people running for president. Both of them were claiming to be president almost up until the end.
Right.
And you end up with some guys being president and stuff because they could speak English better than some other guys, you know, as opposed to they can speak Dari or Pashto better and they understand their culture better.
Right.
The other thing, there's a lot of corruption on the U.S. side. People coming in making bunches of money, you know, going in making bunches of money.
Like these contractors, right?
Yeah, they're contractors, and you got to understand something. You got those contractors, and if you think back on some of these contractors, and you go back in Detroit, and you see these armed people out there when they're going up into the governor's office saying, open up, you know, open up the businesses and all that. And some of these were contractors. Some of these people work for contractors. They were getting contracts from the U.S. government.
To do that?
Well, not to do that per se, but they had, you know, some of these people had ties to some of these contractors.
Now, Doc, we got probably like 5 minutes left. And I know, and just like when we had Dr. Mbui on here talking about COVID-19, I know a lot of what you share with us is going to be real enlightening to a lot of people, because the average person doesn't understand why we're always over here and over there, and, you know, while we're in the Middle East. But now with this transition, and you've already touched on it, how do you think that will affect American society and affect our people, if at all? If it's going to
it's all. You mean this transition now?
Right.
So
we're not pulling out, but transition.
Well, we got 120-something thousand people. African people in this country, Black folks in this country are 13% of the population. We went down a little bit. We about 12%. Only 2 groups went down: Black folks and white folks. And we sort of remained the same, but we went down as a overall percentage. And but we're 40% of the homeless people. So there's going to be a scramble for housing for these folks. Are we going to, you know, how much of our housing is, how much are we going to, you know, that's going to be in competition for what housing, little housing we have. You understand?
Right.
We have to look at these things from our perspective, African people's perspective, Black folks. So when they start marching and beating the drum, we got to not get excited. And we can't look at it from our individual perspective. I'm making so much money. I'm making so much money here and there. So yeah, one person makes a bunch of money. What does that mean for the rest of us?
Right.
You know, are we in the process really creating a situation that's going to, they're going to give us a bunch of money because overall they're going to take more from the rest of our people? So
Right.
we have to think about some of this stuff as well. The other thing we have to understand is that they're switching their focus to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever they switch their focus to Africa, things get tougher on us, not only on the continent, but they get tougher on us here. Because even if we don't understand it as a people, Black folks,
Mm-hmm.
the people who run this country understand it. They understand that Black folks in the United States are Africans and we are part of the African nation, and which way Africa goes, we go, and which way we go, Africa goes. They understand that. They know that.
Right.
So every time there's a move on one, when they went after King and assassinated him, and Malcolm got him assassinated, this is when the same time they were going after Lumumba and Nkrumah and all these other leaders. If there were about 6 or 7 people who had been able to stay alive and
Right.
flourish, if they had been able to stay in power, King, Malcolm, Lumumba, Keita up in Mali,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and 1 or 2 others, we've been in great shape as a people. Go online and look for this speech that Kwame, that Martin Luther King, a sermon he did. Oh, I can't think of the name of it now. He did after coming back from Ghana in 1957. He went to Ghana's independence in 1957. And in that speech, next time I come on, I'll bring on the name of the speech. But he said, I'm going to encourage Negroes in their hundreds and thousands to go and build, Birth of a New Nation. That's the name of the speech, Birth of a New Nation. Okay. He said, I'm going to encourage Black folks, or Negroes, he said back in those times, to go in their hundreds and their thousands to Ghana and to build that nation. Mm-hmm. You understand? Mm-hmm. And he was not able to get to the Congress that they had in December that year in 1960, I think 60 or 58, mm-hmm. 58 the following year. But if he had, we would have had a little different tinge to his movement. He had his own Pan-Africanism. King did, mm-hmm. And Malcolm was even much more so. Right. So Malcolm had met with Nkrumah, and they had formed a kind of understanding that what Malcolm was going to do on this side in the Western Hemisphere. When he talked about, when Malcolm used the term Afro-American, he wasn't just talking about Black folks in the United States. He was talking about African people in the whole Western Hemisphere, North and South America and the Caribbean and Central America. Right. He wanted to organize, and he had, his mom was from his mom's from Grenada. Right. Or Guyana, one of those is Grenada. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so he had ties, biological ties and political ties as well. So so he wanted to do on this side with mm-hmm. his organization of Afro-American unity, mm-hmm. what Nkrumah wanted to do on his side with his organization of African unity, and together that had be some strategic unity and strategic move. Mm. And so Malcolm had to be taken out very early in the game before he could crystallize that. So this is where we are. Mm-hmm. This is where we got to go. We're up against a big obstacle. And we've always been up against big obstacles ever since we've been under this regime of slavery. Right. But we defeated one lower level of slavery. Now we have to defeat the higher level. It's our job. And
Mm.
we're not all going to make it out of this in one piece.
Right. So Doc, I know we coming to an end, but I'm hoping maybe on the next one we can talk about in more specifics, maybe your predictions of what will take place on the continent and how we can combat what you predict may happen. Or
Yeah, okay, that'll be good. And before we go, I want to just encourage everyone out there to get vaccinated. You know, a lot of people have misconstrued some of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They say it's like, you know, like they mention a lot Tuskegee experiment and all that. But the thing about the Tuskegee experiment was that when these Black men were not being treated for syphilis, there was a treatment for it. And that treatment for it was penicillin, right?
Right.
Now, there's a treatment for this. It's not a treatment, but it's something that will help us. It's one tool in the toolkit against the virus, and we have to use it. And I want to mention something. The group has the highest vaccination rate, Asian Americans, have the lowest rate of virus, lowest rate of hospitalization, lowest rate of death. They're also the highest educated group in the country.
Right.
Okay. The group that has the highest rate of death are African Americans. We have the lowest rate of vaccination. We also have the lowest rate of education in this country. We have the lowest test scores in this country. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of incorrect stuff that's going on online, and we're spreading it. And in the same way that a lot of this incorrect stuff happened during the Tuskegee experiment really came out of University of Virginia. It didn't come out of Tuskegee. The University of Virginia developed the Tuskegee experiment, and Black folks just kind of carried it on.
Right.
Some of these ideas, anti-vaccination ideas, have come out of white community, and people are just spreading it, and we're kind of shell shocked. But we haven't sat back and really looked at the data about this stuff. So I'm just saying that right now we are dying in big numbers. We lost 3 years in life expectancy, largely due to this death rate from this virus. So people who are trying to say that if we get the vaccine, it's going to kill us. No, we're killing us because we're not taking all problem. And the other thing is, I've seen people who've died, young people who've died, and they're worried about the vaccine, but they're not worried about their health because they're obese, right? They haven't, they're eating, you know, like our man said last time, you have the sugars and stuff like that. You haven't eaten properly, exercised properly. And so if you're not gonna do the vaccine, you have to do this other stuff at least. Eat plenty of vegetables, not a lot of red meat, or if at all any, you know, plenty of good rest, no alcohol, no sodas, no sweet drinks, no juice, unless it's freshly squeezed like orange juice, but none of this juice out the can or out the thing. And don't give it to your kids I've seen people give juice to the kids in a bottle and stuff. Don't do any of that stuff. That's heading right toward diabetes. So you know, so if you're gonna, if you got to do the whole, if you're gonna protect yourself and you don't want to do the vaccine, you better take care of your health. But really, you better do the vaccine.
Thanks, Doc. You know, appreciate that that enlightenment to the audience, and hopefully people will take heed. I'm fully vaccinated. My son's vaccinated, and just about anybody around me is vaccinated. So I'm definitely a proponent. Thanks for the enlightenment on what's going on in the Middle East. I don't think the average person understands. It's been enlightening, I'm sure, to our audience, but it's been enlightening to me as well. And Doc, we'll see you on the next Full Circle podcast.
Can I say one thing too, though? Sure. Let's not put the average person down too much. I mean, we don't always have the right information, but when they went after Saddam, in in 2003, I think, or whatever that was, they went in there. Black enrollment in the military went down 15 to 16%. We understood it was a wrong move.
Right.
We might not understand all the historical stuff behind it, but we understood it was the wrong move, and we summed it up. And so we just have to connect some of what we already know with just some more information, and we have to set up study groups in our communities where we study these things all the time.
And understand, when I say the average person, I'm lumping myself in that too, because I've been guilty of just like listening to the media. Of course, I've been taught to be skeptical, but a lot of times, like what's going on in the Middle East, I didn't, know, because it wasn't something I researched, definitely. But I definitely see what you're saying. Like, let's not put the average person down. But when I say that, hey, I'm in there too, So I get a lot of my knowledge from you and Dre, and every now and then I research on my own. So hopefully, like what you've shared with us about the Middle East, just like what Dr. Mbui last week shared about COVID, is just gonna, put a lot of people just on a higher plane of knowledge of that, and can, proceed accordingly based on what they've learned, as opposed to what's being fed to us mostly, media wise. So again, Doc, see you next time, and let's dive into this thing next time about, what we're going to see moving forward, and what we can do to maybe combat is too strong a word, but maybe what strategies we can employ to make sure that this turns out better for our people.
Yeah.
All right, my brother, take care.
Okay, take care.
Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear.